and getting into areas of life that make you uncomfortable. I like being selfish. I really have a lot of ambition when it comes to pleasing myself. And it is difficult to remember the needs of others for me. And I don't know if you would admit that or if you don't feel that way, but I'll just tell you that's my problem. But I'm asked to consider what that means in terms of my spiritual nature. I think this lesson, I reviewed it again in preparation for this morning. Wilson's approach to this subject matter of serving one another is a little different than he's had in some other contexts and some other material. And it really comes down to, I think he's making a strong and probably one of the more spiritual, or I'll say metaphysical points than he's made in others. He's going to take us down a road here where he is making emphasis on a somewhat difficult to grasp idea, somewhat an esoteric concept that I think is more and more my understanding of the fundamentals of living as a Christian than I've ever appreciated before. And I think Wilson's going to try to drive that point home by the text and the way that he's ordered this study in this lesson. And he does so primarily by focusing in Galatians. Galatians chapter 5 and getting a little bit of the context around it as well. The optimal word in the Galatian letter is freedom, as evidenced by Galatians 5:1. So we're going to spend some time really dissecting this text today, more so than, I kind of have relied upon you to make your preparation and study, kind of have breezed through some passages where I say, you need to tell me if there's something here you want to spend more time on. Well, I'm going to spend more time on Galatians 5 today. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. Therefore, keep standing firm and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. So, a little context here. What yoke of slavery is Paul making reference to? This is basic stuff. What's he talking about? The problem they had in Galatia. There were those that were advocating for being under the old law. The yoke, I think, as the text used, Jim said, the yoke, the burden, the constraint of the old law. When you think about a yoke being how a team of animals pulls a load or a weight, that's a constraint. That's a device by which to distribute the load over the strength of the broad back of a working animal. And I told you I like being comfortable. I told you I'm selfish. I don't want a yoke. I don't want to carry a burden. But he says the burden here is that you've been under the law of Moses and you've been freed from that. Freed to do whatever we want. No, that's not what the context is going to get into. Freedom, though, from this idea of a yoke of slavery. Behold, I say to you that if you receive circumcision, Christ will be of no benefit to you. So, as part of that yoke of slavery, they were putting themselves under the do's and don'ts of the old Mosaical covenant. And I think we get that. I think we understand that in that context. But you've been set free from these things to a law of liberty, or a law of freedom. And I think that's where I fall short in understanding what is so liberating, what is so free about the law of Christ that he's making this comparison to. And that's what I'm going to try to get in with you today. Again, I think this is somewhat of a sort of a deep theological conversation that I'm going to try to have with you if I'm able. But it gets to making the point about serving one another in ways that we cannot do unless we grasp this idea and understand it very well. Is that the law of obligation makes us obliged to keep the whole law. Jim Pettigo, how many of the old covenant kept the old law to the letter perfectly throughout their entire life? Okay, that's the right answer. I was confident James would get that. With no exception but one, to place oneself under the obligation of perfect law keeping is a fool's errand. Without the grace and mercy of God, it's a fool's errand. And Paul's going to use this idea of the fool's errand to help them understand that idea. This is where I'm going to take a little twist, and maybe I've heard this taught and preached, this particular passage. Galatians chapter 5, verse 5. For we through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness. For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but faith works through love. You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion did not come from him who calls you. There seems to be someone, or someones, plural maybe, that are agitating these folks, and they've received a calling to where they started down a really good path of getting this idea of being free from the law of obligation. To be set free from the law of obligation and to serve under the law of grace. And he says someone has sort of introduced an idea here. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. And so that's usually meant to illustrate, okay, once you get that idea started, and then I get Brace convinced of that, and he talks to Andrew, and Andrew talks to Wanda, and we get this idea spread to the whole group. But I think there's another way in context that you can look at this. It's that little idea that somehow we're going to serve God perfectly just works its way into our real, true basis of knowing that we have to throw ourselves at the mercy of God. And it pollutes it. This idea that we can, by keeping law, whatever that law is, this idea that by keeping some sort of standard of behavior, that I'm going to set myself up for salvation because I've managed to do that. The author says that's not the way we started you on your Christian road. But that's where you are these days. But that idea, then, I think it's true that I can spread an idea and it goes from one person to another, and we say the whole lump then becomes full of leavening in this example. But I would say, think of it in terms of how I think about my relationship with God. And if I've got this idea in my head, I know I'm not subject to the ceremonial laws. I know I'm not keeping the sacrifices and the seasons and the holidays. I know the Sabbath. I've been released from the law of the Sabbath. I know all these things, and yeah, but I'm still going to live and act and think as though this idea of perfect law keeping is going to save me. Now, what does this have to do with serving one another? Why is this the lesson today? And I'll argue that becomes more clear as we look into this. So this is what the discussion is But why in the framework of service? Let's go on and look at this. We've been set free from a law of death. We are no longer under its constraints, its burden, the yoke that says this is how you're going to serve God and keep the law in its totality as your means of having a permanent relationship with God. And I think that concept is the one that Paul's trying to purge here, more so than how false teaching might spread among a community. I think he's trying to argue, get that idea out of your head, because it impacts how you interface with one another. It impacts how you feel about your own relationship to God. Is he watching over me, waiting for me to make a mistake? Or is he a merciful God who says, with the measure of mercy that you give to others, that's the measure of mercy I'm going to extend to you? And so this is a mind changer if you don't have any lingering leavening influence of this idea that the old law and its keeping was the path to finding God. Okay? He says in verse 11, brethren, if I still preach circumcision, why am I still persecuted? And he says, I could easily give into this stuff, and boy, it would make my life a lot better if the Judaizers weren't after me, and I was willing to say, okay, all right, we'll overlook this practice that you're trying to carry over. But if I preach circumcision, why am I still persecuted? Then the stumbling block of the cross has been abolished. Would that those who are troubling you would even mutilate themselves, for you are called to freedom, brother. Only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in this statement: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. You've heard this. I know we've studied this before. But if you can stop and think about, I'm going to stand in front of you today and say, I can boil Christian living down into one phrase. Just one phrase. And it's going to contain all that you really, really, really need to know about your relationship with God. I mean, if you really think that's what Paul is saying, that's what his words seem to be saying to me. And if you really think that's what Paul's saying, then you better pay attention to what he's going to say next. And he says you can boil it all down to love your neighbor as yourself. Oh, but Paul, you've oversimplified things. It's tougher than that. There's a lot more to it than that. You got to know more stuff. But all that will come with time. All that will come with practice. All that will come with the interaction of people who are seeking to serve God and to serve one another. All of that will follow if this part is right, is Paul's argument. And you got to get this right before anything else falls into place. Because he doesn't just say it's one of those really important things. He says all of everything else hangs on this. You have to get this right or nothing else is going to work. That is a big, big pronouncement that's made here to the Galatian people. And you've got those that are saying, oh, you'll never please Jehovah God if you forget these old practices and you forget these old customs. You'll never please God if you're willing to let go of all of that he gave us for our own good. And Paul's argument is, all of that is for nothing unless you get this one part right. You won't get it. You won't get it all together. Now, is that what he's really saying, or is that what I'm reading into it? Because he goes on to say, the law is fulfilled in this one thing. You bind and devour one another. Take care lest you be consumed by one another. In what context does that verse 15 make sense? And I'm going to take a breath and let you answer a question for this morning, because I've been preaching this morning. What does he mean when he says, you bind and devour one another, take care lest you be consumed by one another? What's the problem that he's trying to address? Come on, what's he trying to say? We already said it this morning. Mr. Pettigo, you have a thought? He said, you're going to wrangle over these things? If you're going to keep that one and hang on to that law, that part that God set you free from, that Christ set you free from, then why are we having all these arguments about all this other stuff? Because unless you're going to do it all, there's no point. And he says, so you would sit here and wrangle and bite and devour one another over these points of law when you haven't got this one right yet. And this one upon which everything else hangs is serve one another. Walk in the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. Now, it's stuff like this that Paul goes on to say, to where I say he's not only calling this a foundational concept, he's calling it the pivotal concept. He's saying this is upon which everything else hangs. Because you're just not going to carry out this. If you can serve one another with a pure heart and not put yourself in the way, then that's going to set you free from the desire to fulfill the flesh. And in terms of that spiritual warfare, I think we should all aspire to be the one who has risen to the level of the service that we give to one another is not out of obligation. It's not out of obligation. It's not out of fulfilling the duty of the law. Because the book says we have to. Andrew.
I guess I want something clarified because I may be reading this a little differently.
Okay.
The idea of, he says in verse 14, the whole law is fulfilled in one word: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm just wondering, are we saying that this pivotal concept is pivotal to, is he saying it's pivotal to salvation and our salvation itself, or is he saying that all of the things that all of the details of the old law can be summarized in this one thing to simplify it down? Salvation, I think Paul would want them to understand, is outside of works of the law. Mm-hmm. So by saying it's a pivotal concept, are we saying it's pivotal to an understanding of all those physical statutes or law statutes, but also understand that salvation is outside of the law? I guess I'm not sure if I heard that statement or not.
So what, are you asking which do I think Paul's making application to their pivoting from the old law because of this or because of the new covenant? Or could it be both?
Is love your neighbor as yourself the penultimate summarization of salvation and the law, or is he treating it as a summary of the law, and salvation is outside of that statement?
What do you think? Are you following Andrew's question? David says he's got an idea. Chuck?
I think that Paul is saying to prioritize love first before you kind of get into all the other nitty-gritty of what he's revealed to us through, his letters.
Yeah, I think law is got to be first.
Yeah.
And there's other passages that help us understand that you can do all the right things and not have love, and you're still just kind of missing the boat. If I understand Andrew's inquiry, it's does Paul argue that love is what fulfills the law, or is fulfillment of the law outside of the law altogether? Is salvation itself outside of the law altogether? Is that kind of your question? Not? Okay. We'll try again, because I think it's a good question.
I think what sparked it was, I think you used the phrase, this statement, love your neighbor as yourself, summarizes everything you need to know as a Christian. And that statement that it summarizes everything you need to know as a Christian, I think that's different than saying the whole law is fulfilled in one word.
Okay. So that establishes everything you need to know as a Christian. I'm going to argue that if we look in the next passage, the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, for these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. But if you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. Now the deeds of the flesh are evident, and he goes on into those things. So the fulfillment of the law is in that if you can get the fleshly desire to please yourself and set that aside, then everything that's under the law of liberty is going to flow from that dedication to that idea. Everything under the new covenant is going to flow from that idea that I'm going to serve others first before I serve myself. And Paul, I think he's arguing that is the basis for New Testament living. But in order to bolster his argument, he's saying that was also the basis under Old Testament living. It's not a new idea. And so to say that's all you need to know, let me try to clean that up a little bit. That's all you need to know to start finding a true relationship with God, is learning how to see the needs of others as more important than the needs of yourself. And I think that's his argument here. And from that commitment to seeing the needs of others over your own needs, your selfish nature is going to be moved out of the way to where verse 16, I don't think is one of those absolute statements of, so if I've got that selfless part figured out, I'm never going to sin again. I don't think it's one of those statements. I think he's saying when you walk by the Spirit, you won't carry out the desire of the flesh. You have buffeted your body. You have set things to where you're in control. It's not a yoke that hangs on your shoulders. It's a yoke that you hang on yourself. But not out of fulfillment of law, out of fulfillment of love. Does that make a better foundation for all of Christian living than what I said earlier? He says, throw off this yoke of obligation and take on a spirit of slavery where you willingly have enslaved yourself. And in terms of the service that you give, there's a huge difference in beating someone to submission until they do the work you want them to do, and someone who says, I can't wait to jump in and do the work that God wants me to do. There's a world of difference in that. Oh, right here. Okay. Yes, sir.
I think really what Paul is saying is reiterating what Jesus said. He said, a new commandment which I give you is that you love one another. And yet we expounded on that statement that Jesus made, it's not really a new commandment.
Right.
But it's the way in which it's used for Christians is that if Christians love one another, they're going to put off all the things that cause them to think of themselves before they help someone else. I think it's an idea that the service that a Christian does is willingly, and it's one that's not. It doesn't carry any baggage with it. It's you look to do that willingly and happily.
And he's going to go on to say, when you are practicing the things of those who inherit the kingdom, gentleness and self-control and joy and peace and love. He says, when you practice these things against such things, or against such, some versions, there is no law. He's hearkening back to the old covenant never stopped you from living this way. There was no Mosaical concept that prevented you from having the fruits of the Spirit. And the way he says that in the negative, it's like you should have been able to infer and get from the law itself that these things were just as much foundational ideas as they are under the law of liberty. You may have missed that point along the way, he says, but and Jesus reinforced that idea too. This is not a new idea from God's perspective. This is not a new concept for man. Yes, sir.
I think the way you put it at the end makes it an accurate representation not only of the summarization of the law, but a summarization of our relationship with God. And I say that because when Jesus was asked about the greatest law, he said, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Paul, and then he said, on this hang all the law and the prophets. Mm-hmm. Paul said in this text, to love your neighbor as yourself sums up the entire law. So he left out the first part. Mm-hmm. But when we understand the full nature of what's being spoken here by the Holy Spirit, we really do understand the totality of what Jesus said and what Paul's saying here, and our relationship with God and each other. Because we don't take care of ourselves because there's an obligation, which is the way they viewed the law as a whole.
Right. Right.
They were looking to get something out of it, and it was obligatory for them to keep the various aspects of the law. And if it fell outside of the letter of the law, they felt like they could do whatever they wanted to. Mm-hmm. But in the case of loving ourselves, in the way he's talking about, we take care of ourselves, and it doesn't matter whether, when we grew up, our parents said, brush your hair, wash your face, brush your teeth, eat your meals, all that stuff. We don't need all that outlined for us. We understand what it means to take care of ourselves, and we do that when we care about who we are and what we're trying to be. And so it's not out of obligation. It's not because the letter lays it out. It's not because our parents told us all those things. It's because we know it's good for us. Mm-hmm. And so in our relationship with God and in our relationships with each other, it's not out of obligation. It's because we recognize that it's good and it's right, and we want to do it because that's who we're striving to become. And so I think it does sum up every aspect, and I think it even can fall into the category of what Andrew was talking about with the salvation aspect. We don't want salvation just as some kind of a reward. I mean, when we really grow to have our relationship
or
right,
wage.
When we grow to understand our relationship with God in the right way, it's not just, we don't just do the right thing because we want heaven. We don't just do the right thing because, the letter of the law of liberty in Christ outlines it. We do it because we really truly love God, and we want to be his, and we want to do everything that he said because we know how that makes us to our very core, and what that leads to in every aspect of, the beauty of the rewards. That's great, and those are all things we should strive for, and they're things that give us hope and drive us forward. But there's more to a real relationship with God than just those rewards and punishments and just the letter of what he said. It's really about drawing close to him because of the beauty of who he is and the glory of what he's done.
And that drawing near to God through service to one another works because we see the glory of God revealed in his creation. We see how small things of kindness are so important to people and critical to a healthy spiritual mental state. And Paul is encouraging them to get that whole concept out of duty and obligation, that leavening, out of their thoughts as they think about how it is. We showed you a pathway to God, and it wasn't through duty and obligation. It was through the desire to be close to God. And that closeness to God comes from our closeness with one another. When we are walking, I mean, 1 John talks about how can you say that you are walking in the light if the love of your brother is not in you? Anyone who hates his brother is in the darkness until now. 1 John 1:9. But the one who loves his brother abides in the light, and there is no cause for stumbling in him. I put that 1 John 1:10. There's no cause for stumbling. Just in the same place I put this, well, if you're walking in the Spirit, then you don't violate the law of God. It's not an absolute statement, but it's the road towards God. It's the way we make our walk. It's the way that we conduct ourselves as a Christian that is getting this idea of, I have to do this. Or, there's lots of other motivations too we haven't even touched on. And you had those that gave their alms so that what? They would even ring a bell or something in the temple. It's ding, ding, ding. It's almsgiving time. Isn't that what they were doing? In a very literal way. Look at me. I'm throwing money into the treasury of the temple. And they were mocked for that. When you do your good to be seen of men, you're going to have your reward. We haven't even gone to any of those things. But I think we can more easily understand those false motivations, like, I want other people to think I'm really a nice guy. I want other people to think I'm really important by the way I take care of others. I want people to see the good I do. I think we can see that as maybe more shallow than it is the idea of, I think the still nagging, lingering effect of mankind living under the law was put all this sense of fulfillment of duty out so that you can have a more pure form of service. A pure form is what gets us closer to God, not the doing of the things we do. Right? So in this lesson on serving one another, the whole argument that Paul makes, and I think that Wilson's trying to bring out, is that, of course, we have an obligation to one another, but that's not why we do it. Of course we have that obligation. What's the person who won't take care of their own? They're worse than an unbeliever. Of course that obligation exists. But how are you and I going to live in order to meet that responsibility, but not without the connection first to God, is what he's challenging them to do. And I think, it's a form of, form of rejecting grace and embracing slavery when we go back to the idea of obligation because I was told I need to do this. So we have to talk about the things that we owe one another in terms of obligation. We have to discuss it without me saying, here's the checklist of what you have to do. The checklist mentality, I think, is maybe another way to think about what Paul's warning against. That you'll do enough so that the scales of justice will tip in your way. And that's not how God's scales work. And like I said, this is a more of a philosophical argument. And maybe for some people this is totally unnecessary. I don't need to, debate in my head which is first, the chicken or the egg. I know I've heard this fellow sitting right here with the baby say, if you don't feel like treating other people well, go ahead and do it anyway. And with time, maybe that love for that person will eventually show up in your thoughts and in your mind. I'm pretty sure the opposite is not going to work. If I treat people with disrespect or disregard, it's unlikely I'm going to love my brother the way that 1 John says I should. I'm going to continue to walk in darkness. So if we're struggling with the philosophical argument that this is how all who are free from obligation should feel and act and behave, then start with just do the things that you need to do and work on, develop the love that starts from the way God loved us before we deserved it. If you have to, is what I'm saying. And I think that I've heard Brace speak on that idea of, if you can't grasp that yet, go ahead and fake it till you make it. Because practicing the contrary won't get you closer to loving people by disrespecting them and mistreating them and having regard only for yourself.
Kind of to that point, you don't want to be disingenuous. You don't want to fake it till you make it. But in Romans, it talks about renewing your mind. And there's a lot of studies that you become what you think about all day long. Mm-hmm. So if you sit there and you start every morning, if you're having struggles being nice to a certain person, a certain type of people, group of people, if you start your day with a positive affirmation and you put them in a positive spot and you renew your mind saying, I'm going to be this, I'm going to do this, then over time, it becomes natural. You reprogram yourself. Mm-hmm. And we see that a lot in Scripture when God would tell people when they're coming out of a certain lifestyle into Christianity, and you add the fruits of the Spirit and it replaces the works of the flesh. Same thing with this, and loving one another, getting along with one another. If I put positive mental energy towards getting along with Greg Walker, then eventually I'm going to grow in appreciation. I mean, we may never have this warm, fuzzy, every time we see, we run and embrace like a scene from, a movie.
Not a hugger.
We can really get along and have a great respect and understanding. And it all starts with what's your mental approach and what do you desire? Do you desire to get along?
Yeah, I think so. There was a little conversation yesterday. Allison and I were over at Rebecca Lou's house, and my sister-in-law Julie's in town, Allison's sister, taking care of Mom. And we got talking about people that are always looking out for other people. And with a great deal of respect for those that do so, and also seeing at the same time how they didn't want any recognition for anything that they've done for anyone else. So as in terms of reprogramming the mind, like Aaron was talking about, there's all kinds of ways we can program our thinking. And if we are doing such that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, it doesn't mean you have to hide from everybody everything that's good about what you do for other people. But it does mean don't fall into the temptation that, that felt pretty good when other people knew how I had stepped in when someone else needed something. I kind of like that. That's not a healthy ambition, is to seek out the approval of men. Because honestly, men can approve people that are not worthy of being approved. We have the wrong standards most of the time. So again, serve one another is such a simple idea. I think it's one of those that you can say, if you're on that path and you've got that one right, everything else is going to fall into place. But then the setting aside of self, the doing it, putting my own selfish ambitions aside is the hard part of that whole thing. And I think that's what we're encouraged to consider in our service to one another. I appreciate all the help this morning for those participating in class with us. And we'll maybe do some thought questions. I may ramble on a little bit more in lesson 8, but I'm not planning to. So you can, again, tell me what it is you want to pull out and anything in regards to thought questions, and we'll pick those up for our discussion questions for next class. Thank you.